Welcome to the DX Today podcast, your daily deep dive into the AI ecosystem. I'm Chris, and joining me as always is Laura.
Thanks, Chris. I am genuinely excited about today's subject because it sits right at the intersection of machine learning and medicine. And it might be the most consequential AI story almost nobody is talking about.
So set the stage for me. Because when people hear artificial intelligence and drug discovery in the same sentence, they tend to either roll their eyes at the hype or imagine some kind of science fiction miracle machine.
That reaction is completely fair, and the honest answer lives somewhere in the messy middle. Because something real is happening, but it is slower, harder, and far more uncertain than the breathless headlines from a few years ago suggested.
Give me the headline number then. The one statistic that made you want to spend a whole episode on this rather than just mentioning it as a passing item in a news roundup.
Here it is, and it stopped me cold. As of early this year, there are more than 200 AI-discovered drug candidates sitting in human clinical trials, and yet exactly 0 of them have been approved.
Okay, 200 candidates and 0 approvals is a wild juxtaposition, so help me understand whether that 0 is a sign of failure or just a sign that we are still early in a very long process.
It is almost entirely the second thing, and this is the part everyone gets wrong. Drug development is brutally slow by design, so a pipeline this young having no approvals yet tells you about timing, not about failure.
Walk me through the actual breakdown of those candidates, because 200 is an abstraction, and I want to know how many are early stage versus how many are genuinely close to reaching real patients.
The split is roughly 94 candidates in Phase 1, around 56 in Phase 2, and about 15 that have pushed all the way into Phase 3, which is the final and most expensive testing stage before approval.
That 15 in Phase 3 is the number that grabs me, because Phase 3 is where the rubber meets the road. So tell me what those late-stage programs actually have to prove to regulators.
Phase 3 is the big one, where you test the drug in hundreds or thousands of patients to prove it is both safe and genuinely effective. And historically, this is exactly where most promising candidates quietly collapse.
Let's make this concrete with a specific drug, because abstractions only get us so far. And I suspect there is one candidate that has become the poster child for this whole AI-designed medicine movement.
There absolutely is, and its name is Rentosertib, developed by a company called Insilico Medicine. And it matters because it is the first drug where both the disease target and the actual molecule were discovered using generative AI.
Hold on, I want to make sure our listeners catch why that both part is such a big deal. Because it sounds like there are 2 separate problems the AI had to solve rather than just one.
Exactly right, and this is the crucial distinction. First, the AI had to figure out which biological target to even attack, the right protein or pathway, and then separately, it had to invent a brand new molecule capable of hitting that target.
So normally those are 2 completely different teams, 2 different decades of research even. And you are telling me the software essentially compressed both of those discovery stages into something far faster and more automated.
That is the promise in a nutshell, and Rentosertib targets idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, a progressive and largely incurable lung disease where scar tissue slowly stiffens the lungs until patients simply cannot breathe well enough to survive.
That is a genuinely devastating condition with very few good options. So where does Rentosertib actually stand right now in terms of evidence? Because a hopeful story means nothing without real clinical data behind it.
The encouraging news is that Phase 2 results were published in Nature Medicine last year, and in a study of 71 patients, the drug actually showed improved lung function, which is precisely the signal you want to see.
71 patients is small, though, so I am guessing the company cannot exactly declare victory yet, and there's a much larger and much more punishing trial standing between them and any kind of approval.
You nailed it, because 71 patients is a promising hint, not proof. And Insilico is now in regulatory discussions for a pivotal Phase 3 trial that would likely not deliver an approval before 2028 at the earliest.
So even the flagship AI design drug, the one everybody points to, is still realistically a few years away from a pharmacy shelf, which really reframes how we should talk about this entire field's maturity.
Precisely. And there is actually a fascinating twist, because Rentosertib might not even be the first AI-linked drug to cross the finish line, since a rival candidate could quietly beat it to that historic milestone.
Now that is a plot twist I did not see coming. So tell me about this rival, because a race to be the very first approved AI drug sounds like exactly the kind of drama this industry loves.
The contender is Zovegalisib from Relay Therapeutics, and it is already in Phase 3 carrying an FDA Breakthrough Therapy designation, which is a special status that can meaningfully accelerate the review timeline for drugs treating serious conditions.
So the irony here is delicious, where the drug that became famous as the symbol of AI discovery may actually get lapped by a competitor that generated fewer headlines, but moved through the pipeline more quickly.
It really is, and analysts now put the probability of the first AI-discovered drug winning approval at roughly 60% for either 2027 or 2028, which is a genuinely meaningful but far from certain bet.
A 60% chance is interesting because it is high enough to take seriously, but low enough to remind us this is still a gamble. So what happens to the whole narrative if that first approval actually slips?
That is the existential question hanging over the sector, because the entire investment thesis assumes AI can shorten timelines and raise success rates. And a string of late-stage failures would force a painful reckoning with those assumptions.
Let's pivot to the money then, because where the capital flows tells you what the smart players actually believe. And I have a feeling the dollar figures here are not exactly modest little research grants.
Modest is the last word I would use, because Eli Lilly just expanded its partnership with Insilico into a deal worth up to $2.75 billion, which is a staggering bet on this technology.
$2.75 billion is an enormous headline number, but I've learned to be skeptical of those figures, so break down what Lilly is actually paying upfront versus what is just hypothetical future money.
Smart instinct, because that headline is mostly milestones. Lilly pays $115 million upfront for access to Insilico's Pharma.ai platform, and the remaining $2.6 billion only arrives if specific development goals are actually hit.
So the upfront commitment is real, but relatively contained. And the giant number is essentially a promise that scales only if the science genuinely delivers, which honestly seems like a fairly rational way to structure such a risky bet.
It is rational, and what fascinates me is where Lilly is getting the cash. Because they are essentially reinvesting the enormous profits from their blockbuster weight loss franchise directly into an aggressive spree of artificial intelligence deal-making.
So the obesity drug gold rush is quietly funding the next frontier of computational medicine, which is a connection most people would never make. And it tells you how serious Big Pharma has become about this shift.
Exactly. And Lilly signed more than 10 AI-focused deals in the prior year alone. Several of them licensing agreements worth over $2 billion each. So this is clearly a deliberate strategy rather than a one-off experiment.
It is one thing to license outside platforms, but I'm curious whether these big companies are also building serious AI muscle in-house. Because depending entirely on partners feels like a strategically fragile position to be in.
They absolutely are building internally, and the best example is something called LillyPod, which the company describes as the most powerful AI factory wholly owned and operated by any pharmaceutical company anywhere in the world right now.
The phrase AI factory is doing a lot of work there, so give me the actual specifications, because I want to understand whether this is genuinely serious infrastructure or just an expensive marketing label wrapped around a normal data center.
Oh, it is deadly serious because LillyPod is built on more than 1,000 of NVIDIA's newest Blackwell Ultra chips, delivering over 9,000 petaflops of performance, and remarkably, the whole system was assembled in just 4 months.
9,000 petaflops is a genuinely absurd amount of computing power. So what does a drug company actually do with that horsepower? Because it is not like they are rendering movies or training a chatbot to write poetry.
Great question, because they use it to train foundation models across proteins, small molecules, and entire genomes, letting their teams crunch 700 terabytes of genomic data and simulate molecular behavior at a scale that was simply impossible before.
So we are essentially watching pharmaceutical companies transform into something that looks a lot more like AI labs, which raises a fascinating question about whether the future winners will be the best chemists or the best engineers.
That tension is real, and honestly, the answer is probably both, because the companies pulling ahead are the ones fusing deep biological expertise with serious computational firepower, rather than treating those two cultures as separate or competing camps.
Before we get to the skeptics, I want to touch on regulation, because the FDA has never approved a drug discovered this way, and I wonder whether the agency even has a clear framework for evaluating something this novel.
That is a genuinely thorny issue, because regulators evaluate the evidence about a drug's safety and effectiveness rather than the method used to find it. So, in principle, the discovery tool should not change the approval bar at all.
That makes sense in theory, but I imagine reviewers still want to understand how these molecules were designed, especially when a model's internal reasoning can be opaque. So transparency about the AI process probably becomes part of the conversation. Let me play devil's advocate for a moment, because I think we owe it to our listeners since there have been plenty of moments where AI in medicine was wildly overhyped and then quietly failed to deliver on its promises.
That skepticism is completely warranted, and I share it because we have seen earlier AI drug companies stumble badly when their candidates failed in trials. And a single high-profile phase 3 flop could absolutely chill enthusiasm across the entire field.
So what is genuinely different this time? Because every hype cycle insists that this time is different, and I want to give our audience an honest reason to believe rather than just another round of comforting promises.
The honest difference is that we now have real molecules in real patients showing real, measurable biological effects, which is a fundamentally different stage than the purely theoretical promise we were debating just 3 or 4 short years ago.
That is a fair and grounded point. So, if you had to tell our listeners the one thing to actually watch over the next 2 years, what is the single signal that would prove this is truly working?
Watch for that first approval, full stop, because the moment any AI-discovered drug clears the FDA and reaches actual patients, it transforms this entire field from a promising experiment into a validated and repeatable engine for making medicine.
And if that approval does arrive on schedule, I imagine the floodgates of capital and talent open even wider, because nothing attracts investment quite like undeniable proof that a risky new approach can actually produce a real marketable product.
Exactly. And that is why I keep telling people not to judge this field by today's 0 approvals, because the pipeline is genuinely stacked. The money is committed, and the next 24 months will tell us whether the revolution is real.
That feels like the perfect note to land on. A field holding its breath between enormous promise and unproven delivery. And I suspect we will be revisiting this story many times as those late-stage trials finally report their results.
I have no doubt we will, and I genuinely cannot wait to see how it unfolds, because whether it triumphs or stumbles, the story of AI-designed medicine is going to define a huge part of this coming decade.
That's all for today's episode of the DX Today podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.